education and employment advancement. Then I was on human services, energy and technology, judiciary, and interns. So 6 committees, and the thing that I was most happy and excited about was the work we did on SB2, which was for children's mental health. So I will pass it on to Julie.
Good evening. Is this on? Good. So I'm Julie Kushner. I'm the state senator representing the 24th district, and that is the northern part, so to speak, of Ridgefield, but it actually starts at Cops Plaza, so it's really not that far north. And it includes all the way up Route 7, and also on the west side all the way up to the highway on Sawmill. So it's a pretty big portion. It's about 40% of the population of Ridgefield. I also have all of Danbury and about 60% of the population in New Fairfield. I am the chair of the Labor and Public Employees Committee. I also am vice chair of Public Health, vice chair of Children's, and I serve on Appropriations, Education, and Legislative and Executive and Legislative Management, which is a committee that confirms, that brings to the Chamber's nominations from the executive and legislative branch. That one's the one I have to explain because it's not obvious from its title. Good to see you. And we have Suzanne here, and she's going to do interpretation, so it's great that you're here with us, Suzanne. I've seen her at her best. I watched her interpret Sound of Music last year at Musicals at Victor Park, and it was just amazing, so thank you for being here. So in terms of the thing I felt most passionate about this year, it's hard for me to pick one thing because I worked on a number of things, but I think the one thing that was a long-term effort, and Rudy is nodding his head, he probably already guesses that I'm going to talk about the Firefighters Cancer Relief Fund. We unfortunately have a very difficult situation in our state and around the country where firefighters are more likely to contract cancer from the work that they do on our behalf, on behalf of our community. But it's very hard to prove that it's work-related. And so we have come up with a solution that will give them access to both in combination with the municipal contributions through the insurance that they carry and through the pensions. We also have a fund that will basically equate the benefits they would receive under workers' comp and would also consider it a line of duty death if someone were to perish, and give them the benefits and their survivors the benefits. So it's a huge accomplishment. I came in at the tail end and I've been working on it for 5 years. So that tells you how long this has been in process. And Rudy, as someone who represents the Connecticut Council of Municipalities, has been very involved in it. So I think, through the work together, we were able to find a great solution, and I feel very optimistic. We funded it at $5.8 million this year, and that will put us in a position to really provide benefits to the firefighters. Sorry, that took a while, but I'm very, very proud of that.
I guess I'll pick me to go next. I'm State Representative Aimee Berger-Girvalo. I represent approximately 94% of Ridgefield. I'm one of the few representatives in the House who has only one town that I represent. Most of my colleagues, even though we all have roughly the same number of folks, even if we're in the same size communities, for some beautiful reason, I ended up just representing Ridgefield with no overlap anywhere else, not that you don't have a bunch of great towns. I am on the transportation, where I'm vice chair, public health, and GAE, government administration and elections committees. And the bill that I was most enthusiastically supporting, the high-level bill we'll talk about, so I'm going to actually put that one to the side for the moment and talk about my tiny bill, the one that brought me the most personal joy, the work that I did felt personal, and that was to bring lung cancer screenings to an underserved population. We passed a bill a couple of years ago that provides breast cancer and cervical cancer screenings for folks who are living below the poverty level and who do not have access to health care. And after losing my significant other's father this past fall, I was completely coincidentally asked about supporting a bill that would bring lung cancer screenings to the same population, obviously also across the other side of the gender aisle, because we were going to include men as well because it's lung cancer, it's not cervical, and uterine care. But passing this bill after losing someone so important to me to lung cancer was such an important thing, and even though it only affected a very small population of our state, sometimes those are the things that mean the most, because there are people who are not only underserved, but also just nobody's even talking about what their issue is and what their concern is. So to be able to help a small group of people in such a huge way feels really, really good. And I certainly didn't do it all on my own, but that felt like a tremendous victory. And we actually passed that bill an hour before my 50th birthday. So I call that my 50th birthday present to myself. And now I will pass this on to Representative Denning.
Thank you very much. Keith Denning, I represent all of Wilton, of the 6% of Ridgefield that Aimee doesn't have, and about a third of New Canaan. I am a freshman legislator, so my primary goal was to get through the session and understand how it worked and the process and to get to meet people. And I think what I'm happiest about was that the legislature, the very first bill that we voted on was to stay within the 2017 fiscal guidelines and guardrails to make sure that we didn't overspend. And the very first vote we passed did that. And when we did our budget, we stayed within those guardrails. So I'm thinking this, we are finally having some years of fiscal responsibility that I think that we need to get us out of this spending habits that we have, pay off our debt, and get us into better financial future. So mine is very short, and I will pass it back to Ceci.
Okay, thank you. I did not tell you where I represent. I represent Wilton, Westport, Weston, Reading, half of Ridgefield, the lower half, a portion of New Canaan, Darien, and Stamford. So unlike some of my colleagues, I have 8 towns instead of just one. So it sometimes can be challenging and also wonderful. So I will move us along here and take us to, here we go. Okay, take us to the next slide. Okay, balanced bipartisan Democratic-led budget. And this is important because, as Keith just mentioned, we kept the fiscal guardrails, which is incredibly important on the spending cap, on the budget cap, and we also did the first income tax cut in 30 years, which is pretty remarkable. So it's close to $600,000. I always do that. Do you know that even when I was a buyer at Berger-Girvalo, I used to always drop the zeros? And it was the most embarrassing thing when I talked to my divisional merchandise manager about my open to buy. I always drop the zeros. So you'll have to just bear with me here. It's not because I don't know how to read the numbers. $600 million in tax cuts. This is tough. Can I get your language? Great, thanks. Okay. Okay, good?
Yes.
Okay. And then the tax cuts include single filers earning up to $150,000 and couples earning up to $300,000, pension annuity earnings exemptions. We fixed the cliff. There was a lot of feedback, I remember from talking to people on doors, that they found that the pension and annuity earnings exemption didn't work for them because they earn just a little bit too much to be able to access this. So it increases the income limits for a single filer up to $100,000 from $75,000 and couples up to $150,000 from $100,000. And this was passed really, this is quite bipartisan in that in the Senate, out of 26 senators, there was only one negative vote. And in the House, it was 139 positive and 12 nays. So that's very much a bipartisan budget when you think about, when I think about all the bills we discussed across the way. And then to continue on that, it included $3 million to expand Husky healthcare for children up to age 15. A year ago, they had made it up to 12. They found that that just really was leaving a lot of children uncovered. And so we moved it to 15, regardless of immigration status. Also restores 100% of the New Haven Metro North train line and branch lines next year, which is very disappointing because we were all arguing for it for this year, but it will be restored next year. And then provides $12 million over 2 years to nonprofit organizations working to reduce gun violence among youth. And this was my favorite, establishing the Office of Behavioral Health Advocate, but I'll talk more about that when we get to that slide. Okay, increasing gun safety. I'm going to keep talking. So this was something that I heard, again, all across the district in every town, the importance of really tightening up our gun violence laws, because we just know everywhere, we see it almost daily, that there are incredible numbers of gun violence. And I think it was, I heard the other day, it was over 270 shootings that included more than 4 people since the beginning of the year, which is nothing short of stunning. And so what we did was ban the open carry of firearms in Connecticut, limited bulk purchases of handguns to 3 per month, so we could cut down on straw purchases, and then increased bail, probation, and parole for high-risk repeat offenders, updated the ban on unregistered ghost guns, and then the most important thing, I think, is we increased our safe storage laws, so that now the gun must be locked up all the time, not just when someone is outside of the home. So that is to protect children, and is to protect people who might want to harm themselves. So this was a very important piece, and I heard all of the public hearings on this and listened to everyone as they spoke about it. So I personally was very happy to vote for this. Okay, preventing wrong-way accidents.
So this has been something that we've been talking about since, for quite some time. I have been on the Transportation Committee since I first was elected when we started in 2021, and we were talking about this then. And then we had terrible tragedy on the night that we were all sworn in, where I lost a very dear friend. I think he was a dear friend to many of us up here, in a wrong-way accident. And it certainly was already on the agenda. We were going to be taking this up, but it certainly gave it an urgency. And I have been very, very pleased with how not only extraordinarily bipartisan the conversation about wrong-way driving was, but also how thorough it was, and how collaborative it was, how much we worked with multiple committees and with multiple agencies to arrive at some of these changes in legislation. So we've got detection and notification systems installed at more than 120 highway exit ramps deemed high risk for wrong-way drivers. A pilot program will be established to announce alerts about wrong-way drivers on a highway message board. I will tell you what that means. And grants to test and analyze directional rumble strips to alert drivers they're going the wrong way. So this pilot program is interesting because when these accidents happen, you usually only have minutes to get out of the way, essentially. And if you don't know that that's coming, you don't see it if you're on a blind turn, as was the case with my friend, State Representative Quinton Williams. If that's the case, you've got no chance. There's nothing you can do, especially when you're driving at highway speeds. So I'm very hopeful that this pilot program will give us show us that this is really something that is effective. And I would imagine that it will be based upon the data. One thing that I want to highlight is wrong-way accidents when we're talking about these in the country, 60% of wrong-way accidents I hate using accidents, wrong-way crashes. I have to get away from that because there are choices that are made that could prevent this. 60% have an impaired driver across the country. In Connecticut, that's 80%. We have an impaired driver problem here in this state, and we're going to talk a little bit later. Hopefully I'll get a chance to talk about Vision Zero, which we don't have a slide for, but we have some time at the end. I will talk about the Vision Zero Council and the legislation that we passed there. We did not get to pass legislation that would lower the blood alcohol content, but that is something that I'm very interested in having a conversation about going forward and engaging multiple agencies to try and see if there's anything that we can do.
Do you want to continue just talking about Vision Zero right now?
Sure,
And the
sure.
red light?
So the Vision Zero Council was, I'll be really quick because I know we have a lot to cover. The Vision Zero, I'm going to let the coffee kick in and now she's going to talk quickly. The Vision Zero Council was formed in 2021 and it's a multi-agency group including DOT, DMV, Public Health, pick an agency and they've been involved in this. And they made recommendations over, I think it was about 14 months of this working group. They made recommendations to us as a legislature where we were able to put together, with the guidance mostly of DOT and DMV helping us to write that legislation, but again, with input from all of these agencies, we were able to put together a piece of legislation that addressed turning fatalities, and particularly with pedestrians, from multiple deaths a year to none. That's the goal. One is too many. So the idea is to reduce to 0 the number of pedestrian fatalities in crashes. We did pass this. I actually don't want to miss, I'm going to look at some of the things because I think it's really important. I'm just going to list the kind of bullet points of what we covered. So, okay, so it made recommendations, there it is, that we would have a public awareness campaign for drug-impaired driving. So in addition to alcohol-impaired driving, we want to talk about drug-impaired driving, especially since we've legalized cannabis. A safety course after traffic violations to resolve the ticket before the hearing. Because what does the ticket do? The ticket, it reminds you that you shouldn't be doing that, but if you can have an education, if you can have a conversation, you can have a lesson in what you're doing is wrong, and in doing so, you're able to not have to have that fine. Everybody wins, right? And then there's a DOT 5-year capital plan, an equity proposal, which requires the DOT to consider recommendations by an equity subcommittee, and that considers all infrastructure for DOT accordingly, and that, again, all to address pedestrian safety. And then we also had a conversation about automated enforcement. So there's been a lot of conversation, I think, and with a lot of misinformation about what that means, but essentially towns will have an opportunity to opt in to red light and speeding cameras, which will be in operation for, the idea is to have an opportunity to use this in your community in a place where you think, where the data shows that the accidents are happening more frequently, but to not have any kind of skew so that we're not just putting them in black and brown communities. We don't want anybody to feel targeted. We don't want anyone to feel as though, any community to feel as though this is a penalty that must be paid because you are someone who can't take it to court and fight it. So there's an equity element in that. The two pieces that came out of it that I was disappointed to see go, but it came through a collaborative conversation, were mandatory motorcycle helmets. That was not part of this bill. I just heard somebody, never mind, I heard someone say, yes, it is, you know what, it is stupid to not wear a helmet when you're riding a motorcycle, and that is the fact. And the other piece was the blood alcohol content that came out of the bill. And there was much more support for that. I know it was a little bit of a struggle in the Senate, but it passed pretty handily in the House. So that's Vision
Thank
Zero.
you, thank you so much. And I just want to mention that one of the reasons this legislation was so important is in Stamford, they have had multiple pedestrian deaths over the past couple of years. And putting this red light, I don't know if they're going to do it, but putting the red light in, if anyone is driven through Brooklyn or Queens and you get an alert on Waze saying, be careful, this is a 25-mile-an-hour zone. Well, my daughter ignored it, and it was my car, and I got all these tickets, right? So it does actually work, the red light. Well, it worked for me. Anyway, so moving along to maternal health.
Right, I'm going to take this one, I'm going to stand though because I know there are people over, they can't see me sitting behind the podium here. So I worked on the maternal health bill in the Public Health Committee, and this is another bill that I've been working on for years. You might not know this, but there's only one birth center in the state of Connecticut, and that's located in Danbury. And they have been operating for 26 years. It's a really wonderful place. One of my colleagues in the legislature had her baby there, and you had your baby there too. It's just an incredible place, very well run, very well established, and run by a practice owned by two doctors and run by midwives. And what I learned when I first got elected is that they were not licensed as a birth center. They were licensed as a maternity hospital, which is an incorrect licensure. And for years they've been trying to get that corrected. And it's important for the Danbury facility, but it was much bigger than that. And what I was very happy to learn is that the Commissioner of Public Health, the previous commissioner and the current commissioner, were really interested in seeing birth centers as a way to expand services, maternal health services, especially in areas where we have maternity deserts in our state. There are parts of the state where people don't have easy access to birth centers, to hospitals to give birth. And so and the other thing that's great about a birth center, it can be at much reduced cost than being in a hospital setting. Now the key here is that the only people eligible to participate in it have to be low-risk pregnancies, and that's a critical piece of it. But when you're a low-risk pregnancy, you don't need all of the technologies and all of the availability of services that you have in a hospital that can be quite costly, and so this can bring down cost. We know that in Danbury, we took a tour of the facility this year with the commissioner, and I learned so much that I thought I knew already. But one of the things that was really important to know is they accept Medicaid and Medicaid, not Medicare, and 20% of their population is served as Medicaid patients, which really tells you that there's a need for this in communities where people don't have high-quality, affordable insurance. So the maternal health bill was something that was initiated by the governor. I think we can take a little credit from the legislature because we've been sort of hawking them for years that this is something very important. But they really got on board, and so we will now have an ability to have a proper licensing of birth centers. There will be a period of time, I think it's 5 years, where they will not have to go through the certificate of need process, which is a very slow process, but we'll be able to establish freestanding birth centers more quickly. There's great protections in there for both the patients and for emergency care if you need it. And so it's a very strong bill, and one that was really, the people at the birth center in Danbury did a lot to provide the information, the expertise that went into making this a very strong bill. In addition, we're going to be studying infant mortality. We have to get a handle on this. Why is it happening? Where is it happening? So we have provided the ability to have a study of infant deaths. We also are going to increase the use of doulas and provide certification for doulas voluntarily. And one of the great things is built into this bill is a universal nurse home visiting program after a baby is born, months 1 through, from the time of birth up to the 3-month age. That person should have a visit from a visiting nurse in their home, which is really incredible. And we also are extending the time to enroll newborns in insurance from 61 to 91 days. So it's a bill that really a lot of people worked on, and I was very excited to be part of it. And the next line I'm taking too, because this slide includes creating a path to greener, healthier schools. And I was very fortunate in 2022 to be named as the co-chair of the working group on indoor air quality in our public schools. A mouthful, but I learned to say it because it was one of the things that we learned during COVID. There's always been a problem with indoor air quality in our public schools, but during COVID it became so critical that we realized how devastating it can be if your schools do not have good ventilation. And so through legislation in 2022, we created a working group. We had all the partners, every stakeholder was at the table. We had teachers, we had superintendents, we had principals, we had the trades, we had experts from ConOSHA, we had every agency that touches indoor air quality in our public schools, so Department of Education, even DEEP, even the Department of Administrative Services, everybody was at the table, and we spent a good deal of time trying to figure out how do we get to a place where in Connecticut, every school in the state has good ventilation. It is a challenging and a daunting task. It is not something we can solve overnight. The original bill had that there would be school inspections in every school that was built since 1854, and I was like, what is 1854? Well, that was like the oldest still operating school that we had, and they wanted to make the point that we have these old schools and we need to address them. So now, in addition to having the working group and setting up, the immediate thing we did was we require now we recommended and now required, based on current legislation, annual school for tools inspections. These are very easily conducted inspections at every school in the state. They'll have annual inspections, and then every 5 years, there will have to be a licensed technician that does a ventilation analysis for each school. We also are investing in standalone ventilation projects. The first $150 million came in last year's legislation, but we increased that by $300 million in this biennium budget. There has been some news recently, I don't know if any of you read about it, the first tranche of applications went through, and it was disappointing that out of the 130 applications, only 80 were approved, 80 were rejected, I'm sorry. And those were rejected often for technical problems where a signature was missing, a form wasn't filed. There's a lot of discussion about why this happened. In fact, I have a meeting tomorrow morning with the commissioner to talk about what we'd like to see going forward. But the reality is that DAS and the governor's office took the approach of wanting to get those projects going as soon as possible. So last year there was a focus on shovel-ready projects. And so the school districts that got the money were basically the ones that were ready to do it anyway, which actually meant most of them were ones that had the funds to do it without the state support. Now, we know going through this that we have to look at this through a different lens and make sure that it's equitable. And so that's something the working group is going to focus on next year. So did Danbury, Clyde did not get it funded as well. One of the things I was quoted on just last week in the newspaper, and I know my colleague in the House agrees with me, or the co-chairs, we both agree that we would like to see DAS give out all of the money that was allocated for last year by going back to those districts that made application and giving them an opportunity to correct the problems in their application if that's doable. And so that's where we stand on it. We also worked on getting the Connecticut Green Bank will develop a new program to help schools become more energy efficient. We're going to incentivize cost-effective ways to decrease greenhouse emissions and focus on net zero energy programs and projects.
Thank you. Now, protecting voting rights and voting access.
So I'm on GAE, so I will go through this as quickly as I can, because I see that clock ticking. So we talked about early voting after the state overwhelmingly voted to have early voting. We wanted to be able to talk about how we were going to implement this. And early in the session, we had a meeting with our local registrars of voter right here in town. I know that you guys did it in all of your communities.
And League of Women Voters.
Yes. But we had a nice conversation with Cindy Bruno and Wayne Global right here at Ridgefield talking about what does it really look like to implement it. And when I was sitting in the public hearing in GAE, Secretary of State Thomas was sitting before us and testifying on, in support of the elements that she wanted to see, many of which are here. And she looked at me and she said, oh, and I talked to your people, and she knew exactly who was in Ridgefield, and she had done that with multiple communities across the state. And anybody who reached out to her, she responded. Whether they supported her or not, what she wanted to know was, I need to understand how your community can implement this, because the point is implementation. The point is not we won, we got early voting, and this is just something that we have to get done. It was, we have to get it done, we have to get it done well, and we have to get it done right the first time so that we don't have to go back and fix this, and so we don't have any major errors. So these were some of the things that we all landed on as committee and between the Secretary of State. 60% of voters supported the early voting ballot initiative. That is a very, that's a good number, and it was a number that made us comfortable enough to really look at this aggressively. So 14 days of early voting for general elections, 7 days for primaries, 4 days for special elections and presidential primaries. Budget funded $5.4 million to implement early voting initiatives, including $1.8 million for municipalities. It's going directly to the municipalities. So regarding the early voting, and actually we can envelop all of this right into the no excuse absentee voting, which will be on the ballot in 2024. 27 states allow for no excuse absentee voting. The whole point was that we are trying to get in line with what the rest of the country is doing, and to open up and make sure that we have access for every single voter to be able to do this. There was a lot of concern about the budget and money for early voting in particular. And essentially what came away from that was sort of an ad campaign. That was really the main thing that was lost in a reduction of the sort of pie in the sky dollar figure that we all wanted for it. But it should not affect the actual implementation on the ground with municipalities.
And maybe that's going to be next year, right?
Yes.
Early voting will not take place this year. It'll be instituted for next year, just so everyone knows.
Yes. So another really quick summary, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. It makes resolving Voting Rights Act complaints easier and faster by fast-tracking the complaint process at the local level. So this is going to be something that I know that our own registrars of vote are well equipped to handle. In fact, I always say this, but I would encourage, if you have never spoken to the registrars of voters in this community, go ahead and talk to them, both of them, and find out how seriously they take their job. It is impressive for sure, and it is encouraging. And I think that if you talk to these folks, you will understand how seriously they take this job. Creates a central data hub for publicly available election and demographic information. Expands language assistance for voters, empowers voters to fight against intimidation, deception, and obstruction, helps municipalities identify and fix problems before voters are affected, and will enable Connecticut judges to order appropriate, tailored remedies to address harm. These are all of the things that we have been talking about, that we were concerned about. They were all addressed pretty specifically in this legislation.
Thank you. So we're going to move now to increasing transparency in education. And this is an interesting slide because, an interesting concept, because when school districts try to look at how they're balanced against other school districts, everybody does their accounts differently. And so that makes it really difficult to understand what the cost per pupil is, because there are different buckets in every school district. So we're going to identify, so setting up transparency by putting together with the State Department of Education a process by which we can start getting information from school districts to look at that and be able to see where the money's going and how we can help and how we can make things better, and then identifying strategies to improve school climate And that's not the air quality, that is about bullying and the actual social climate inside the schools. And then I had mentioned to prioritize the SB2, which is this bill here, prioritizing the mental, physical, and emotional well-being of children, and that was very important to me. And that included putting in place the Office of Behavioral Health Advocate. So that person will be an attorney, they will sit inside the insurance department, and they will be able, I just got an email today from a constituent needing help on insurance coverage in behavioral health. So this person will be able to work with both providers who are being denied payment and also families who are being denied payment, being denied access to insurance. And then also within that department, there will be a patient navigator. And the patient navigator piece is very important because when you're struck, when one has to deal with a family issue or a spouse or a child or a parent who is experiencing mental health, and you have no process to know how this works, a patient navigator will be able to help. And they will be the ones that will figure out the service delivery system, and there will be somewhere to turn. So this is really important. We're going to have an advisory committee from across the state who will be working with this office to make sure that the process is going well, to review it. And I just asked a well-known patient navigator who has a private practice if she would be on the advisory committee yesterday, and she was very anxious to bring her expertise, so I was very excited about that. And then additionally, it is about mental health days. We passed a law which says that with sick days or PTO, you can use a day for mental health without having to discuss it. You can just take the day for mental health, which is really, we're trying to normalize mental health and people being aware of what they need in their lives. I know that when my children were little, I would let them take 2 mental health days a year. They could take one in the fall, they could take one in the spring, they could take them both together, but I wanted them to be aware of their own mental health and take care of themselves. So that's what we're doing here with mental health days. Also, it requires play-based learning for kindergarten and preschool students so that we are not just focused. A's and the ABCs and the colors and the numbers are all very important, but so is play-based learning, because that helps with self-regulation, it helps with neural pathways and growth. It's very important. So I was really excited about all the pieces. And the last piece, since we're in a library that made me very happy to put in place, you all know that there have been book bans across the country. The numbers of book bans across the country have gone from 769, I think, to 1,270. That's wild and shouldn't happen. And the majority of those book bans are either LGBTQ, trans youth books, or books that discuss diversity and to discuss different lived experiences of Black and brown people. And we cannot have this. So what we did was we worked with the Connecticut Library Association using the model in Stamford, which is a sanctuary library. We talked to the Connecticut Library Association. They didn't want to go in that direction. They didn't want to use a word like sanctuary because they felt it was a little incendiary in some communities. So instead, what we asked to do in this statute is for every library, every principal library in every town to put in place governing documents that allow for a book to be challenged and then sets out a specific process by which that challenge can be identified, worked through. So I know, for example, recently in Westport, they had several books that were challenged, and they had a 12-step process that the entire community went through, and that's what we're asking. It doesn't have to be 12 steps. We're asking libraries to put this in place at the local level, make that decision, put them in place, and the libraries have not been funded on the state budget since 2015. And libraries are librarians are incredibly good at using even the smallest amount of money. So these grants to libraries that put these governing documents in place will be between $1,500 and $3,000 per library. But when I told the librarians that I was talking to that was going to happen, they just radiated. They were so happy to think that they might get funding. And we had a little clapping in the back of the room. So this was SB2, and I was the chair of children, so I was very excited to get this across the finish line. Okay, we're going to go to the next.
So data privacy is one of the things that is up and coming. The legislature is trying to address how to deal with the new technologies coming out. AI, or artificial intelligence, is growing daily in what they can do with data and information. And so the legislature wants to make sure that privacy is protected. Bans geofencing. If you don't know what geofencing is, it's when a perimeter is set up around a building and or social space, and when somebody goes into it, your phone may get a ding or a send or an information. And this was set up so that people who would go to a healthcare clinic or to a mental health clinic, they would not be inundated with this kind of information being sold to public technologies. Bans, of course, consumer health data. You cannot tell everybody what's going on. Minors, you're not supposed to advertise, and if they decide to end their account, they have to cut their account within 15 days, and they can't keep coming back and asking these kids, are you sure you want to cut your account? They have to do it, and we're going to try to enforce that. Protecting survivors of domestic violence, money to expand GPS systems. I'm sorry. Okay, down here. Okay, I'll let you handle that. This is one of the things about addressing privacy is that this is going to be something that the legislature is going to have to look at every single year, because we don't know what's coming out, and we do know that they can take, like someone can do taking a video of me right now, put it out on the internet, and have me saying something that is absolutely nothing that I said, but because they have the photo and the technology to manipulate my voice and my facial features, they could have me saying anything. And so those are the things that neither the Connecticut House and Senate nor our federal government fully understands how we do it, but technology companies are asking that we try to do something. So this is something we all want to follow.
Didn't mean to stop you there, but
That's right.
this was my priority bill right here, the big one. SB 5 was the bill that addressed domestic violence. And so a couple of things that it does: provides $8 million to expand GPS monitoring to keep survivors safe. And jumping to the bottom, it invests more than $43 million to the Victims of Crime Act fund. That middle portion, though, is the one that I worked on specifically. Prohibits any alimony by a domestic violence survivor to their current or former spouse who is convicted of certain violent crimes. And actually, it doesn't have to be it is their spouse, but they have to have been convicted of certain violent crimes. If they are convicted of abuse against the person from whom they are seeking alimony, that will now not be allowed. And when a friend of a constituent came to me and asked me if I would be interested in sponsoring this kind of bill and maybe moving this legislation forward, my response to her was, how is that not a law already? And I see a lot of heads in this audience doing the same thing. It makes absolutely no sense. I think it's important to highlight Connecticut is now only the third state in the country to prevent this from happening. This needs to be federal. This needs to be across all states. When I was interviewed about this for the Connecticut Examiner this week, the reporter asked me, so what does this say? What does this legislation tell the constituents of Connecticut? And it says, to me, it says that Connecticut believes those who survive this kind of violence. We believe you, we know this is happening, and we will do whatever we can to prevent you from having an injury added to your injury. So, and this was a very important bill, and this one passed an hour into my 50th birthday. So this was, I had a really good couple of hours in the House.
Okay, thank you. Holding utilities accountable. A lot of people this past year talked about the utility bills and the high cost. And on the one hand, bad news is utility costs are not going to go down as low as we would all like them to go. But what we did do this year is preventing utility companies from using ratepayer funds to cover lobbying expenses and food and drink and transportation and entertainment. They are making a significant amount of money in the utilities, and the fact that ratepayers were being charged for these things, again, it's like, what, right? So we stopped that. And then it also creates a fund allowing taxpayers and organizations to access legal representation to challenge the utilities' proposed rate increases. And the reason that's important is because in order to go up against a utility company on a rate increase, you have to have a deeper pocket. And so this creates the fund to do that. And finally, it strengthens the regulatory environment for utilities. And what that affects is PURA and Chairwoman Gillette and the work that she's doing with the Public Utilities Regulation Agency. So it's not, I just have to say, we didn't get as much done on climate, which is why you're not seeing a climate slide, but at least we got started on the utility side of things. Okay, so we're going to move to housing, which I know is a big topic, and then we are going to go to questions. Okay, so we're all going to address housing. Oh, I went too far, sorry. Oops, apologize. Yes.
So I'll start. This was a bill that was debated in both the House and the Senate. It went back and forth a bit, and it ended up passing in the Senate on final passage after many hours of debate. The first point that I think has been the biggest concern of people is where are we going on fair share? And so what this bill contains is it contains a provision for a study of the methodology to establish what a fair share policy would look like. Once that methodology, and I think OPM is the Office of Policy and Management, is responsible for leading that. Once that is concluded, that study is concluded, it has to come back to the legislature before it could be enacted. So that is the part I think that was the most controversial. The rest of the bill includes protections for renters. It also gives municipalities an ability to have inclusive zoning and would receive an incentive there of a 5% bump in their school construction reimbursement for every 5% increase in student enrollment they realize. There are also incentives for the creation of workforce housing, which is a really important topic that we've heard actually in every community, including here in Ridgefield. When we talk to constituents, we know there are concerns about the affordability of housing for teachers and for firefighters and for the people who work in this community, being able to live here as well. And so that is a really important piece of this. OPM will also study state-owned property to see if there are opportunities to develop for affordable housing, such as community lots and other non-conserved lands. And then there's going to be the creation of a majority leaders roundtable on affordable housing to continue this conversation about how do we make sure that our state encourages affordable housing throughout and make sure that people have opportunities where they're limited now. And I think housing is probably one of the biggest issues confronting the people in Connecticut today. There's not very much housing stock available in a lot of the parts of the state. And the rental prices are very high, as well as property prices are very high. And then finally, a pilot program to provide grants, rebates, or financing for certain multifamily projects that will work on improving energy efficiency and health and safety concerns in homes, particularly located in environmental justice communities or alliance districts. So Danbury is an alliance district. Waterbury's an environmental justice district. So places that have been impacted would have opportunity in this pilot program to receive grants and rebates. So it was a very big bill, very hotly debated. It changed a lot from its inception, its initial passage in the Housing Committee. But ultimately, this is what we could come together around and pass in both the House and the Senate, and has been signed into law.
Thank you. So that takes us to questions and comments and concerns and ideas, and I know people are anxious to get to that. Do we have a microphone for people? Absolutely.
This gentleman will start.
Yes, I am representing a group called Citizens for Connecticut Reform.
Do you want to use your mic, sir, so that people can hear?
Can you hear me better?
Yes.
Okay, so I am a local biologist, and this is, we've been counting butterflies for 28 years in Reading, which has unique and very good meadows for butterflies. This also applies to the town of Ridgefield. And what you see is over 28 years, we are finding 50% less butterflies. We are coming up with what's called an insect apocalypse. This is affecting our pollinating insects. This very carefully, this decline seems to start in 1996 when the introduction of neonicotinoid insect pesticides. All the corn and soybeans that are used in food formulation now in the United States use neonic-treated seeds, which confer tremendous resistance to pests. Unfortunately, one neonic seed can kill a bird if it eats it. And the chemical gets into the pollen and is poisoning our pollinating insects, including our bees. So we proposed a bill this year, SB 963, of which CCU were a co-sponsor. I don't know what your other statuses were. Well, thank you. And we will be at it again next year. And we are going to go away from the environmental angle and we're going to go at the health angle. Because this is poisoning. You talk about children and stuff today. This stuff is water soluble. It's turning up everywhere. Distances from where it's applied from studies done in Iowa and New York State. And Long Island tried to ban it, and it is still getting into Long Island via, you can order it by mail.
Okay,
So,
thank you so much. And
Okay.
yes, we did, we worked hard on this, and I was talking with the chair, Senate chair of the Environmental Committee up until the very last hour.
is this Fresco?
No, no, this is,
Really?
no, hang on one sec, Lopes, Rick Lopes,
Oh,
Senator Rick
Lopes,
Lopes.
okay.
And so I was talking with him, and I could not move him on getting this going, so we will go back to it, I
Okay, well, this
promise.
is very serious stuff.
I
and,
know, thank you,
Kara
sir.
Lippman, our leader, is doing a wonderful job, and I'm available to consult with you. I'm a biologist. Yeah, anybody can see.
Okay, thank you so much.
Let me just say that there were many of us who supported that, so we are going to
Yes.
get back to it. We were disappointed in the way that it ended up, and
For future
so we
support, you
we
can
will be there
contact
again.
keep that. This is an important issue for the state of Connecticut. Thank you for listening.
Hi there, my name is Jackie. I live on Abbott Avenue. And we have a proposal for a 14-unit, 3-story monstrosity in the middle of our block. And we all hate it and we don't want it built. I want to know, as this bill came to be, as you sort of worked on this bill, opposed this bill, what thoughts were given to zoning changes or wetlands or any of that, because we have problems there. And we don't want a building like that in our neighborhood. We don't want to become a city. We just want to keep our block. We have maybe 11 single-family homes and 29 apartments already. And those apartments are housed in houses that look like houses along the street. They're not apartment complexes that you would find, in the city, or some Norwalk or somewhere. We don't want this. We love our street to be a walkable street, a Halloween street. I saw kids the other day, racing up the street in their rollerblades. That won't be anymore. We have 50 more people and 25 million more cars. Not gonna happen. So what thought was given when this was all passing? Was there anything going on in the background to plan for zoning and wetlands and things like that? Because popping a building like this in the middle of a tiny neighborhood just seems insane to me.
Thank you for
Sorry,
your
I'm
question.
so aggravated with this.
I know, and I know it's been a big topic in town.
Yeah.
Obviously, this bill just passed and was just signed into law, so it is not something that affected this particular building. However, you asked what was the thinking when this bill was being.
If you know this is coming, then what are you gonna do about zoning?
So, when this bill was coming up, and there's a lot of conversation about it, the reason that I voted for it was because, and I voted for it, so I just want, everyone knows that, you can see my record.
I voted for you.
No.
You didn't vote for me.
Okay, hold on one second, because in fact, I did vote for you, because in this city, in this country, oh God, sorry, in this state, we need 89,000, I'm gonna stand up, I can't do it sitting. We need 89,000 units of housing in this state. Electric Boat is putting on thousands of jobs. ASML in Wilton, 1,000 jobs they're planning. Where are the people going to live? We want a vibrant, very strong state, and we have no place for housing. We have no place for people to live. Now, I'm not saying that what's happening on Abbott Street is a good idea, and nor am I saying that this particular bill that I voted for would have even done that. This is a study. People think that it is more than a study, and it's not. It is a study which is perhaps flawed. And part of the flaw may be conservation discussions. And oh, thank you so much for doing that. Conservation discussion, the wetlands, all the things that we know in our area. But those pieces, when this bill comes, when the study comes to the legislature, I know you don't trust me not to think about it, but I truly do think about it. I think deeply about not just the district, but also the state. Because we need a vibrant state. We need a state that welcomes business and has housing for people. And when I talk about 89,000 units of affordable housing, I'm not talking all low income. I'm talking affordable, someplace where I can downsize. Right now, that does not exist, okay? So putting in place a study, which then has to get through the House and the Senate. The bill that was originally proposed was absolutely dead on arrival in the House, and they prevented us in the Senate from having to vote on it because it was dead on arrival. This is a study. We need to figure this out. We're going to be having a lot of conversations. Did you want to speak?
Which bill is this?
This is the 998.
Okay, no, Bill 998.
Yes.
Phase 1 just passed, so didn't it?
But it isn't a phase one. It is a study inside the bill.
Okay.
So, for the record, I did vote against that legislation, but I did not vote against affordable housing. Unfortunately, because of the way that the process works, I was working, in fact, I was texting with Planning and Zoning Chair Rob Hendrick right up until my vote. We were having this, because we got it in the House before you guys got it in the Senate, and but there were conversations going on for months and months, and the initial bill was dead on arrival. It wasn't going to make it out of the House. And then the conversations with different communities, planning and zoning chairs, Rob Hendrick worked with planning and zoning chairs around the entire county, I think, for the most part. And they gave us feedback. This isn't going to work for us. What are you going to do about it? And we said, here's what we're going to do about it. And a bunch of us were in the majority leader's office and in the speaker's office immediately and constantly. He started letting me know when I needed to get my hair dyed. I'm not even kidding. He just wanted me out of the office. we were having a lot of conversations about what that bill would look like. And none of the things that were opposed by our community here and actually ended up in that bill. However, it was rolled out at midnight, and it was not possible for me. I did have texts with the gentleman here in the second row, but there was no way I was going to be able to get Rudy on it. Rudy, I was not calling you at midnight. So, but we were able to have this conversation about what it looked like. It actually is a study. It actually isn't going to, that bill in the form that it is not, it isn't doing what your community is experiencing. And I do understand and sympathize with you on that completely. One of the things that we talked about, and that I know that I've been talking about at length with the majority leader and with those in the housing committee, are the plans that Ridgefield already has in place and has had in place for, some of it has been a decade, and that is development for an underdeveloped part of Ridgefield, and that is Branchville. And that area is, there have been plans in the works for many years, and they're actually gorgeous. You can go right into town hall and get a copy of what that looks like, I would imagine. But what we're talking about there is being able to develop housing around transportation. Now, me, as a transportation wonk that I'm becoming, because of my role in transportation in the committee itself, we're all concerned about the increased traffic here in town. Well, the only way you decrease traffic is if folks don't have to drive all the way here to work our restaurants, our galleries, our schools, our fire departments. So we need to be able to do that hand in hand, and that transit-oriented approach, which is being handled handily by our planning and zoning and our inland wetlands and our board of selectmen, is the key to being able to expand our housing. And so hopefully, and as we work together to try and move these kinds of bills forward, hopefully what we'll be able to do is show that we're a model for building affordable and creative options for housing, and a range of housing, which is really more the point than anything else. If we can show that we're the model, and we can show that what we're going to be able to do here in Ridgefield can be used in communities that look like ours do, then we're going to win. You know, that's a win for our community, and that's a win for our state, because nobody's going to come here and bring their businesses here if they don't have a place to live. So ultimately, we have to get there.
Can I hear your question?
Wyatt and Eustace Lane, thank you for spending time with us tonight, and thank you for all of your work on our behalf during this legislative session. Senator Maher, I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about SB2 and specifically the book ban issue. I think a number of us, many of us have observed, unfortunately, some of the toxicity that we see at the national level seep into our community politics and our local politics. In Newtown, we just saw the Board of Education confront a motion for a book ban for LGBTQ+ content. Members of that board actually resigned during the debate. This is a very vitriolic and charged set of issues, and I'm very glad that you were able to get SB2 through. My question is, can you give a little bit more color on whether that was an effort that was bipartisan? Do we have support, broad support on the implementation of that legislation, and how do you see state and local cooperation in that legislation actually being enacted and being a force against censorship in our local schools, our local communities?
Thank you for the question. I am really happy to tell you that it was a bipartisan bill, that it was passed with both Republicans and Democrats, and the ranking member, the Republican ranking member on the Children's Committee stood up and spoke in favor of it. So that was a really positive thing to have happen. Within the committee, the Children's Committee, prior to voting the bill out of committee, after the public hearing, there was a lot of conversation that was pretty rancorous about libraries and what kind of books were in libraries and what kind of sexual content were in books. And so there was a lot of that kind of questioning that went on of our librarians across the state who came to speak in favor of the bill. I don't know how we're going to move forward in our society until we all start trying very hard to work together and not use the easily accessible language that points fingers at other people and instead have conversations with them. And so that's why my ranking member of the Children's Committee got up to speak, because she and I had a conversation about it and she supported it. I hope it's a model. In Illinois, they passed the first ever ban against book bans in the state of Illinois. We didn't want to do that. We wanted to create more of a carrot than a stick, so that's what we did. I just would have to ask everyone, please, we're here, and this is not about you at all, please don't get that on. This is, no, I mean, just what I'm gonna say. Talk with us. You know, this is really important. We really do represent you, and we do think about you and the towns we represent all the time. And it is incredibly important to me that we create community, because the best bulwark against the kind of things we're seeing across the nation is our talking to each other and creating community and having open conversations. And that is what's going to save us as a country and as a state and as our towns.
Hi, thank you all for being here, and thank you for being so supportive of the LGBTQ+ community. My question is, numerous states have enacted bills that curtail the rights of LGBTQ and transgender members of our society. What is the state of these rights in Connecticut? Have attempts been made to issue Florida-style policies in Connecticut?
Thank you so much thank you for asking that question and for bringing such an important issue into this room. To answer the back end of your question right out of the gate, I actually went and looked to see how many proposals were right here in Connecticut for this one single session, and I lost count. There were so many members of the General Assembly who wrote bills just like what's happening in Florida. They didn't get any traction here because we have a majority who is not going to let that go anywhere. But I want to be very, very clear. This is not a bill that has anything to do with protecting children, protecting families. This bill concept, any of the concepts that attack the transgender community, particularly when we're talking about children, these are culture war bills. These are created to create divide. And we're talking about 1.6% of the population. Why are we spending this much time trying to adversely affect that community? It is potentially happening in this state, and that is why elections matter. Elections matter, elections matter, elections matter, because it is happening, and it's happening right around us. And there are folks who will reach out to us who have their ideology fits in with what's happening in Florida, and the language, the vitriol with which they address the issue is it's incendiary, and it is fueled by the cultural conversation that is happening nationally. It's not going to happen on our watch, and that I can promise you, it sure as hell is never going to happen on my watch. But it is definitely not, just because it's not happening here doesn't mean that there isn't an undercurrent.
Yeah, I have a question on early voting. Is November next year the first time we will have early voting? Is that correct?
Yes, and we're looking, I'm sorry, and we're looking at, as Aimee mentioned, we're looking at ways that, to make sure that the local towns, the 169 towns, are covered with the early voting. So we'll be readdressing the budget component of that in February, when we go back into session.
And let me just be, maybe the best and easiest way to think about it is that the municipal elections will not have the early voting that we just passed into law. But next year, we will have the early voting in the 2024 elections. So in the presidential, the state, wide elections, those will have the early voting.
How about the primaries? Next year's primaries?
Next year's primaries as well, the entire voting system. But this year, under the municipal elections, they will be done the same way as they've been done in the past. So there won't be any change this year until the end of 2023, and it will be put into place for 2024.
Okay. My name is John Tocaglia, Danbury Road, Ridgefield. I have two questions that they may be a little technical, forgive me. The first is this particular omnibus bill that was passed, Connecticut Examiner, Connecticut Insider, they mentioned it is quite large, quite thick, and it went through whatever the legislative process is, up to almost the minute of the end of your session, or the actual end of your session. I'm concerned that you're not reading the bills. You see bullet points up here, but the governor on the RAC issue, a line or two that was inserted in the legislation that he said I never read before. It had to do with favoring a Republican district. Something got stuck in the bill. I'm concerned that you as legislators are not reading the bills and limiting yourself truly to understanding. I don't understand from this conversation if in a deadline situation like that, I don't feel confident that you've all read the whole thing and reread it and know exactly what's being passed. That's just an observation. I'd like to know a little bit more how you do it, each of you. The second question relates to home rule. Connecticut, as near as I can understand, is different than other states. I think the first or the second state created it. It had a series of 3 constitutions, but they had kind of a organization of home rule that differs from many states. So in the zoning field, in the zoning or the housing, when the mandate of a state to a town, I'm seeing the state constitution here granting much more power and much more control by the town, by the selectmen. The best we will ever have is in the room now, ever. But how is it that you reconcile in our constitutional, so our state, the power to do half of the things you've been talking about here today? You're talking about manipulating culture, manipulating land use, local issues. I'm not understanding in this state where you get this omniscient power from, and if you understand the limits under this state's constitution. And it is a little technical, and I feel very strongly that you're straying from the essential task unnecessarily. So I'm trying to focus on necessity and prudence, which is, I think, the 2 words they used in our state constitution. I'd very much like to hear how each of you do it or approach it, honestly.
Okay, thank you. I, again, appreciate the question. 6-month legislator, so just going to say, I do read the bills. I also read, and everyone can, because they're all online, you can read the bill summary, and I also read the financial impact, and I also look at the public hearings and what the public has come to say. So initially, we started with about 5,000 bills at the beginning of the year, and we ended up with about 250, 80, I can't remember the total number that we did end up passing, but along the way, I was reading the bills, and sometimes bills come out of one bill. There was an 86-page housing bill that we all talked about was dead on arrival, but I read every single page of that and took notes. And then when the bill that came in was presented, I read the summary and I looked up all the pieces that I was questioning previously. So yes, we do it, but I also have to tell you, honestly, I rely on the delegation by town because all of us have a window into a different committee. You heard us talk about what committees we're on, and I cannot read all the bills that come out of their committee, but they're reading them, and then they share their information and knowledge with me, and we talk about it. So with the children's bill, I got so many questions from friends in the House, or colleagues in the House, about the children's committee bill, and then I was able to answer it for them. And I did the same with public health and all the other bills that we talked about. So we gave you bullet points because the bills are long and often arcane. I will say back to the chart, the Constitution, one of the things I learned as a legislator is that in fact, the vast majority of, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but the vast majority of the power sits inside the Constitution and the state. So for example, all of the local boards of education are actually given their power through the State Department of Education. That is the empowering agency. All of the P&Zs are given their power through Statute 8-2, which is the statute that addresses P&Z. So all of the power doesn't actually reside in the towns, and that was something that shocked me when I found that out. The power actually resides at the state level, and then it is empowered within the towns. So I'm getting that right, I guess, because Rob's nodding his head. And I was actually very surprised about that. I thought, we've talked about local control so much, and I guess I drank the water on that, but in fact, the state owns the power. And that's why you send us up there, so that we can be your voice and also work. And I hear you when you say about the omniscient, because I questioned the same thing as we were going through the process. But what I didn't know when we were presenting bills was that we have crackerjack, Office of Legislative Research, Office of Policy Management, Office of Financial Analysis, and they are lawyers and they are people who understand all this to keep us all from going off the guardrails. So
They're also, I just want to add a little bit because they're also nonpartisan. The people who work in these departments are nonpartisan. They absolutely do not have any affiliation with either party. Most of them have been there for a very long time and have worked with leadership of the legislature and leadership from the executive branch from both parties. And the other thing that I just wanted to add, and I think, by the way, Ceci, for a new legislator, is doing an amazing job. And I can tell you she does read everything. I watch her sitting in the chamber. She listens to every debate in the chamber. And it's very, very impressive. But in addition to what she mentioned, we also have another whole process that we go through. After the committees have passed all their bills, then we actually have what's called a caucus. Each caucus of the legislature, there are 4 by party, 2 in the House and 2 in the Senate. We have regular meetings that go on sometimes for hours, and each committee chair will describe the bills, and we will have debate and conversation internally. We don't always agree on the bills, but we have the opportunity to really question in those meetings. In addition, we have policy staff that sit in on those meetings that have expertise, can do research, in addition to the nonpartisan staff who advise us, as well as attorneys who are paying attention to the constitutional questions that come up. And they do come up, those are issues. I had a bill that was going to go into effect, and it appeared to retroactively impact contracts, and I was told, no, that's constitutional law. You cannot impact contracts that have already been executed. It has to be forward, impact has to be on future contracts. So there are people who are advising us on these matters. I know the reference that you were talking about with the governor I was a little surprised when I heard him say he didn't know about it, because the budget process itself, there are multiple people from both caucuses, both chambers, and the executive branch that are going line by line by line. And on top of that, when the bill comes out, believe it or not, before midnight, we have heard from lobbyists all through the building that have read every single word and are looking for what they call rats, things that they didn't like, that weren't ever litigated or weren't ever, didn't completely go through the legislative process. They're looking for those rats. And I've had people come to me and say, there's a thing in here about restaurant tipped workers, and it shouldn't be in there, and then everything stops, and we have a big meeting with the Speaker of the House, and with and because I'm the labor chair, like everything literally stopped until we could resolve whether that was something legitimate or not. So there's a lot that goes on in terms of the process, and I think, we go up there, and there isn't really a minute's rest when we're in the final, well, actually from the first day of the legislative session, there isn't a minute's rest. You are, especially in the Senate, I would like to say, because we're on so many damn committees, excuse me, but being on 6 committees is no small task, and it really is a tremendous amount of work. I'm not complaining about it, because it's also unbelievable experience. I know more about government than I ever thought I would know, from being, from serving now in the legislature, and I feel very much like, I feel very much like very privileged and honored to represent the district, because I've learned a lot, and I also feel like the work we do is really impactful.
So we're going to have one more question, but before we do, Aimee just wanted to say something.
One of the other ways that, and I'll go through it very quickly, one of the other ways that we all kind of get that overview of whatever the individual bills, because you mentioned how can you possibly read all of them, we are given a go list before we come in. So whenever we start at 10 o'clock in the morning, we are emailed a go list with all of the bills that could possibly be called that day. So when you see us, if you see an image of us sitting in the chambers, reading at our computers.
We're not sitting in the chambers because we're reading
Somewhere that's actually quiet, right, it's so that we can, because a lot of those bills aren't what they looked like. They're a work in progress. They come out of committee and we say, we'll vote for it in good faith, knowing we'll vote it out of committee, knowing that it could and will change, just as the housing bills, just as all of the bills really ultimately have some sort of tweak made because OPM finds something that could potentially have been a rat, or OFA finds something that maybe is not going to be approved in appropriations, and we've got to be able to, appropriations, excuse me, relingo, I to stop doing that. But we read those bills when we get them in the actual form that they're in, and that's why, getting back to the housing bill, that one we hadn't been given in its form until that moment, which is why I ended up having to vote against it, because I was unsure. We, as a team, which we really had become, were unsure about what it would look like. By the time it got to the Senate, the bill had already been passed, and if they had changed anything in the Senate, we would have to go back and vote on it in the House. So the bill stayed the same way when it got to the Senate, which was probably, 24, 36 hours later. Something like that. We lose track of time in there. We do call it the casino because we have no idea what time it is. We're there, the sun is up, the sun is down, sometimes it's both.
Last question?
That's right.
Hi, how are you? I have one back here. If we go here, okay.
My name is Kirk. First of all, I want to thank you for coming tonight. Although I will say, I think I'm not alone in saying that I was very disappointed that you didn't come before you voted on some of these measures. I know you were invited by the Board of Selectmen repeatedly and declined those invitations. And frankly, I personally felt that was unacceptable. As far as HB 6633, which is the Fair Share Bill, is concerned, we all heaved a great sigh of relief when Jason Rojas announced that it was dead. It was going to be the very biggest mandate, I think, in Connecticut's history. It would have cost Ridgefield $350 million potentially. It could have required us to build or for developers to build 10,000 units in a town with 9,500 units. So it's a really awful bill. So it's good that it was killed, and I want to thank you for doing that. On the other hand, a piece of it, and it's not a study, it's a phase one. Phase one was clipped out of 6633. It was put in SB 998, and it was done at 11 p.m. It was finally voted on at 2 a.m. I'm very grateful to Mr. Denning and Ms. Berger-Girvalo for voting against it, but I think there was really no good excuse for voting that in, particularly the way it was sneaked into a bill that was supposed to be about, believe it or not, abatement on conservation easements. To slip that into another bill in this manner is very, very underhanded, and I frankly, as a voter, don't appreciate it. So I don't know what you, I'm not asking a question, I'm making a comment. And I hope you'll think about it if you're confronted with something like that again. I know this is your first time in, and so I mean there's a learning curve. So maybe to some degree we have to cut you a little slack, but it's kind of hard to do. So thank you for listening.
I just want to, I think that we should clarify what happened when we were supposed to have a meeting with Planning and Zoning and Board of Selectmen. They did invite us. We all said yes right away. A colleague of ours took her own life, and we had a funeral that day, and so we could not attend, which I know everybody was very understanding about. And then we were in the thick of the final 4 weeks of session, and there was no day when all 4 of us could have come together. But with that, we were in constant, each of us were in constant.
We also met that morning, that Friday morning, with Connolly and Rudy.
Yes, we did. We had a meeting with them one-on-one, but not with the entire community.
No.
Correct. Yes, we did. We met with Selectman Connolly and Selectman Marconi to discuss process. You know, how could we possibly make sure that we get all of the information to you guys and to Planning and Zoning. Planning and Zoning is the board that you as a community elected, that we as a community elected to do this work for us. Board of Selectmen, we elected to do this work for us. So I certainly trust that those boards are able, capable, and willing to do the hard work to communicate with us what it is that the community is looking for. And they did that. And they advocated for Ridgefield. They advocated for all the voters of Ridgefield and all of the non-voters of Ridgefield. They advocated for you and for your community. And they got us all of that information in real time. And we were having a back and forth the entire time regarding these bills. So, and it wasn't just the fair share bill. There were multiple housing bills that we were talking about with regularity. We had a meeting, a Zoom meeting with the chairman of Planning and Zoning, along with other Planning and Zoning chairs in the district and other legislators across the aisle. It was collaborative and it was transparent. We had them with, I mean, it was at a certain point, it was a little difficult, to Mr. Tartaglia's point, to get to all of the other work because we were all so focused on trying to make sure that we were hearing what was going on here in the community. So I just want to be very clear. In no way did anyone here not want to have that conversation. It just didn't work out that was something that we can do, and we've never really been able to fit that kind of timing, and especially in that last month. It's why we do our Meet Your Legislator early in the session. We usually do that in February, and then it is buckle up, Buttercup, because we are going down and not able to really even look up from the work that we're doing until we get to that midnight sine die moment when session ends.
So I'm sorry, the library, how do you want to handle it?
You did indicate this one last
Okay.
question, and then that'll be it. And we're after with close now.
Hello. Oh, okay. Hi. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for this opportunity to meet you and your presentation. I learned a lot, and I really appreciate your commitment to our community and the hard work that you do. I actually had two questions. The first quick one, I loved that I saw play-based learning in kindergarten. Like, I got really excited. I wrote it down. And I was just curious if it is formally going to be added to the standards, the learning educational standards, and does it replace something else, or is it in addition to?
It does replace something else.
Okay.
It is not going to be an addition. We
Okay.
don't want to put more stress on the
That's what I
children.
wanted to, yeah, because it's so long overdue.
And that's
Thank
going to be
you.
worked through with the State Department of Education.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. That's long overdue. I mean, it's very important, and I'm very happy to hear that. You know, the other question really has kind of been answered. It just had to do with the housing bills. I am definitely concerned about the fair share and where it's going to go. I would like to mention that Ridgefield had a goal of maintaining 30% open space, and so we want to keep that. I mean, if I'm correct, right? I just want to keep that in mind when we're talking about building all of these units. You know, a lot of us moved here for that open space, and also that open space is very important in general for mental health, but also for the humans who live there. You know what I mean? And it's really important that we keep that in mind. And just to say, while I appreciate that you have those conversations with our Board of Selectmen and our Planning and Zoning Chair, and yes, we did elect them, I do have to say that we are your constituents, and I would, you know, I did not hear anything from these ongoing conversations, and I am a resident of Ridgefield, and I don't know how I would have received that information, but I was I tried to come to the source, you know, and you know, I emailed you, I was trying to be respectful, and you emailed me right back, and I appreciated that. I know how busy you are. But I just wanted to say, I think it's really important to make the time to hear from your constituents and not just the, you know, the boards. So, and I appreciate that you had a death, and I apologize, you know, I'm sorry for your loss. But, you know, I hope that we can meet next time. So thank you.
Thank you. I really do, I apologize for not saying that our first select person, Rudy Marconi, was in the audience in the beginning, even though he has sat here through the whole thing and listened to us, so thank you. And
There's
also,
a number of elected
and
officials, so
other,
just raise your hand if
yeah,
you're an
could
elected
you?
official.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Conley, sorry I messed up your name, Sean, and Robert Hendricks, and was there someone else? Oh, hey Joe, how are you, Joe Shapiro? So thank you all so much for being here, thank you for taking the time, we really appreciate it, and please do reach out to us, I think we all do want to hear from you, and do try to get back to you.
Where's the
And
best place to hear your news?
our news?
Yeah, like
Is
where's
that
reading?
like a setup? Is that a setup? Yeah. Because in the back, on the table, is a place to sign up for our newsletters.
Yes.
Okay, so that you'll be in the know. Okay, thank you. Thank you all so much.